In the first instance, phylogenesis appears to be one of science's discarded concepts. However, if one looks to the history of philosophy, one finds, from the pre-Socratics, recalling Anaximander's naturalism, to modern philosophy, Nietzsche's lessons of earlier humanity, a continuous effort to account for the relation of the human animal, ontogeny, and the species, phylogeny, or in the language of pre-modern cosmology, the relation of the human being to the cosmos. Recast in biological terms, the question of recapitulation looms large over the history of philosophy and psychoanalysis. As psychoanalysis ages, my paper asks the question, should phylogenesis be considered anew, and if so, as what? A biological concept or an ontological one? If it is to be reinterpreted in light of new scientific discourses, for which there are many, one can only think of epigenetics to start, it must also take stock of what has been lost and what has already been said, to return to the spirit and the letter of Freud's writings on phylogenesis. Freud did not assign a minimal relation with respect to ontogenesis and phylogenesis. On the contrary, the question concerning their relation is a privileged one. Within the Freudian corpus, phylogenesis is one of the most important sites of conceptualization. Yet despite the insistence of this concept, it appears to be more or less discarded by psychoanalysis in general. Phylogenesis does not appear in La Planche and Pontelly's Vocabulaire de la Psychanalyse, and more or less by Lacan in particular. Focusing on the latter, we may say that the more concerns how Lacan a prioristically rejects the idea that the Oedipus complex is naturally and biologically transmitted, equating phylogenesis with biology in a strict sense. Concerning the less, while Lacan's a prioristic thesis relies on a rigid biological concept of phylogenesis, at the same time, it provokes a reinterpretation. To this end, the task of my paper seeks to put forth a psychoanalytic and philosophical account of phylogenesis, thus desynonymizing phylogenesis from its reductive biological baggage. Lacan's apparent glossing over of this concept should not be interpreted as a relinquishment tout court. Rather, it should be understood as a question of emphasis concerning where the stress falls. For Lacan, who never abandons a species-specific form of questioning, I argue that the stress falls on the philo of phylogenesis, in contrast to Freud's stressing of the genesis of phylogenesis. Hence, the latter's fixation on the parabolic and the unrelenting search for origins. Regarding the architecture of my paper, firstly, I will discuss Freud's use of the concept of phylogenesis and how this relates to metapsychology. This inquiry is guided by the question, how does phylogenesis function as a short circuit between natural genetic transmission and cultural non-genetic transmission? This disquisition gives rise to further questions concerning sexuation and sexual neoteny, and here I closely follow Lorenzo Chiesa's systematic approach in the Knot II, whereby sexuation is articulated as the transcendental logic of our human-animal species, while sexual neoteny links the protracted helplessness, Hilflosigkeit, and structural incompleteness of the human animal to sexuality and sexuation. My paper advances the thesis that if sexuation is a species-specific logic, then it should be thought of not only in ontogenetic terms, but phylogenetically, such that diachrony concerns these two levels and should not be over-identified with a strict developmental template. Regarding these final conjectures, I will present some preliminary materials. So firstly, Freudian phylogenesis as metapsychology. The concept of phylogenesis accounts for what is underdetermined, variation in experience, historical contingency, and so on, as well as what is overdetermined, biological and natural inheritance. As a concept, however, it is irreducible to either the undetermined variant or the overdetermined invariant, and must be understood as having both a biological and historical element. Firstly, it involves what Freud calls the recapitulation theory, according to which physical and psychical individual development recapitulates the entire physical and psychic evolution of the species. This thesis affords us the possibility of positing a relation between infancy and prehistory, as Freud does in Totem and Taboo, and between adulthood and civilization, as we find in Civilization and its Discontents. This correspondence is made possible due to what Freud calls archaic heritage in Moses and Monotheism, which comprises not only dispositions but also subject matter, memory traces of the experience of earlier generations. Archaic heritage, we may assert, is also, we may assert, is both biological, it has instinctive tendencies and dispositions, as well as historical with respect to memory traces and primordial guilt. It involves biological lines of development as well as psychical ones. With respect to cultural and symbolic transmission, memory traces concern what is carried forth psychically, establishing a relation between memory and history. These correspondences bring to the fore a vestige that does not belong to the individual, mortal substance, as Freud calls it, but rather to the immortal substance of the human germplasm, which is a rather lamella-like analogy. Despite the biological overtones, one must not lose sight of the cultural pitch of Freud's argument, which insists on the psychical dimension, an irreducible factor that makes Freud's position incommensurable with a strictly Lamarckian one. As Freud insists, quote, "Physical recapitulations are transient stages. They are replaced by subsequent forms," end quote. However, there is no homology with respect to the mind. The psychical apparatus has no baby teeth, so to speak. If we think of Freud's theory of topography, there is a coexistence of consciousness and unconsciousness, whereby only the latter has timelessness as a predicate. Indeed, Freud draws upon the analogy of the unconscious as an internal city, a palimpsest of historicity that is somehow frescoed into the mind. Indeed, only in the mind can this form of preservation exist. In Freud's work, Phylogenesis takes on many forms, all of which are indispensable for his metapsychological thinking. Second part, Freud's primal text, Totem and Taboo. The accounts given by Freud in extremis bespeak the very absence of a definitive origin, and thus an undecidable element that remains unaccounted for with respect to the origin of the socius, and thus the symbolic in the law. The signifier metapsychology registers how psychoanalytic thinking can and should intervene within the entire field of human relations. Indeed, to reverse Lacan's statement, it's not a doctrine but a quotation, when Freud argues in his letter to Fleiss that all psychology is metapsychology, it is a doctrine and not a quotation. To this end, the question pertaining to metapsychology is not what is metapsychology for Freud, but rather what is not. To put it another way, phylogenesis is a metapsychological concept. If we understand metapsychology to be a short circuit within the Freudian field, the discourse of irreducibility of nature and culture, which insists that the meta level of the unconscious, i.e. the socius, cannot be thought of as ancillary or epiphenomenal. Indeed, it should be thought of as an attempt to articulate, in a preliminary manner, the incompleteness of structure or the gap introduced by the unconscious, which only later names the reality of the inconsistent other. For anyone who is not privy to Freud's myth, it bears repeating. Freud makes use of Goethe's saying that in the beginning was the deed, thus reversing the gospel. It is not speech that grounds the origins of the socius, but rather a primordial crime. Concerning the deed, Freud's hypothesis regarding the earliest state of society, a state which precludes the possibility of empirical observation, is discussed in chapter 4 of the text. Freud takes up Darwin's monstrous hypothesis that the earliest society consisted of a primal horde, headed by a tyrannical father who possessed all the women. His only enemy was the forcibly celibate band of brothers who, in gaining strength, posed a real existential threat. Indeed, the sons commit the act of parricide, yet Darwin and other evolutionists hypothesized that the new social tie brought about through parricide would only lead to an equally monstrous fratricide. Yet this Darwinian account discounts the structural necessity of libidinal ties. By contrast, Freud theorized that the criminal deed of parricide and the subsequent ingesting of the dead father would ensure that the sons would be permanently racked by guilt. As Freud vividly remarks, quote, "In the act of devouring him, they accomplish their identification with him," end quote. While horizontal libidinal ties ensure that the deed was committed, prohibition by guilt founds the origin of the socius. As Freud attests, quote, "This deed marks the beginning of so many things, of social organization, of moral restrictions, and of religion," end quote. As Freud reminds us, the prohibitive products of filial guilt, the two fundamental taboos of totemism, murder and incest, inevitably correspond to the repressed twin wishes of the Oedipus complex. However, Freud warns against collapsing these two taboos, for they are not on par psychologically. The murder taboo is grounded on emotion, while the incest taboo serves a more practical function. As Freud writes, quote, "Thus the brothers had no alternative. if they were to live together, to institute the law against incest, by which they all alike renounced the women for whom they desired and who had been their chief motive for the parricide. End quote. It is through deferred obedience in the face of guilt's affectionate current that gives rise to what binds together the social tie and its institutions, what enables acquiescence to the barrages of interdiction. At this junction, we may question whether Freud's concept is a mere heuristic tool or a necessary fantasy, as Catherine Malabou and David Benheim seem to suggest. Firstly, it seems necessary to pin down what Freud precisely means by historical, for historical cannot mean historical because the event here, the traumatic event, forgotten as well as remembered, with its uncertain chronology, is not exactly an event in the traditional sense of the term. And the reason for this is because the historical event, take totem and taboo, is deprived of all contingency. The relation of history and event is fundamentally contingent, and therefore the conditions do not obtain in the case of totem. Thus, the question concerning did it really happen is superfluous with respect to the founding or primal argument of Freud's text, the act of parricide. With recourse, quote, the slightest trace, unquote, and this is Lacan, of the primal father, Freud attempts to account psychoanalytically for the enormity of his discovery of the unconscious. And I'm breaking with Lacan here. Thus, culture becomes a site of inscription of this discovery while simultaneously registering the logical contradiction that is elemental to this thinking of origins. Freud's account in Totem introduces a logic of exception, and this is a very Lacanian point. The exception of the ones who found the social order as those who are not subject to the castration and Oedipus complexes. Thus, Freud points to a transcendental element such that the socius cannot be thought of as an immanent field. These elements register how the question of origins is marred by undecidability. What becomes unthinkable in structure, given that we are in a social order, the semblance of a social and political order does in fact obtain, are the elements that make this very structure possible, without which the structure itself would be inexplicable. To this end, we can accept the predicate necessary, as Malabou and Benheim suggest, and call it what we like, a fantasy myth or Freud's dream. And here I follow Malabou's argument that the structural necessity of Freud's myth should be understood as genetic, thus stressing the importance of genesis for Freud. The necessity at play, however, is not deterministic or mechanistic, but should be thought of as genetic, insofar that we can think of inheritance as a part of a program. The traumatic event qua program, and here I quote Malabou, is from the outside transcribed and expressed each time in a different way. This difference itself becomes inherited so that the offspring are affected by both the trauma and its modifying reception, end quote. Thus, we can see how the biological and the historical find their dialectical expression in the concept of the genetic. And we can make sense of how not all human beings are explicitly affected by the primordial crime, or to put it more bluntly, some are more racked by neurosis and others less. At the same time, the uneven distribution of guilt and trauma does not contradict the structural necessity of the deed. This enables Freud to say that civilization is neurotic. The fact of variation cannot be taken as an objection to the universality of phylogenesis. On the contrary, it proves that the universality, identity, and similarity attached to the archaic do not doom individual psyches to just follow or obey the program without any variation, as if rigidly determined by its coding. Moreover, this argument holds with respect to the Oedipus complex. While it is the first complex, so to speak, there is a variation with respect to individual structure, yet this variability does not stretch out infinitely. Similarly, sexuation bearing the mark of universality is not undercut by the variation with respect to the ways in which human beings parse structure. However, there are only two ways to parse structure, i.e. masculine and feminine. Yet this limitation does not preclude the enormity in variation within structure. We can avow variation without indulging the narcissism with respect to sexual idiosyncrasy. With that said, I will now turn to a text from Freud's Spätwerk, Civilization and Its Discontents, which arguably recapitulates his entire oeuvre, which is undeniably marked by sexuation. Part 3, Chronic Malaise. With respect to qualifying what accompanies, or depending on how you read the text, what precedes culture, Freud struggled to find a word that could encapsulate the precarious nature of civilization. He began with the despondent Unglück, but settled on the vertiginous Unbehagen, translated literally as uneasiness, and more elegantly as discontent. In this late text, Freud offers an evocative characterization already adumbrated in Totem and Taboo. At the origin of the socius stands primordial violence. The necessity to register this primordial crime introduces disequilibrium into the social tie, untying us from any pretense of unity. With respect to the origins of civilization, there was never any primordial unity or pre-established harmony, and it would be equally dubious to posit the existence of a pre-established disharmony. Rather than posit a primordial chaos, Freud's discourse highlights the ways in which structural incompleteness manifests as chronic discontent. Freud links the founding act of violence to advances in intellectuality and in culture. It seems important to stress the methodological point that I've been insisting upon, that Freud's analyses of the meta level of the unconscious are not merely sociological. It is not a logos of the social, as Freud's self-critique makes clear in the opening pages. With respect to culture, inheritance must be thought of as socio-symbolic, if we think of language as a combinatorial system of signifiers and the other as always already preceding us. This is where the philo and ontogenetic overlap in their lines of transmission for the human animal qua speaking being. The renunciations required to upkeep civilized morality and mores, which in most cases can be traced back to earlier instinctual renunciations, beg the question: how did external coercion become internalized? How did the superegoical function come into being? According to Freud, external coercion becomes internalized with the advent of the superego, a psychical agency that issues forth commandments, without which one could not become a social or ethical being. The most perverse commandment, according to Freud, is "thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." The question concerning external coercion, however, must also be inverted. How do our internal conditions, such as our protracted helplessness, find external support in civilization? As Freud writes with respect to widening the circle outside of filial structure, quote, "The phylogenetically older mode of living together, the one that only exists in childhood, resists being superseded by the civilized one," end quote. There is a coincidence of uneasiness within the subject's own being, the endogenous uneasiness that finds its cultural correlate in civilization can be traced back to neoteny, as Freud writes, quote, "In the very beginning, it seems, the external world, objects, and what is hated is identical," end quote. This observation gives rise to the question: if the fundamental motif of aggressivity is inextricable from sexual neoteny, can we say at the same time that civilization bears the mark of sexual neoteny? If the ego remained hermetically sealed, there would be no speciation, given that egoic autoeroticism would dispel the external world and the need for objects. However, at the same time, neoteny prevents this, such that human beings' entrance into the symbolic is structurally necessary for survival, ontogenetically, but also phylogenetically. Thus, we may posit that there is a structural necessity to de-autoeroticize, however incomplete this process may be. The tensions that straddle the hatred of the world and the need for love is captured by Schiller's poem, The World Weighs, from 1795, and I'll read a little stanza. "The construction of the world, philosophy holds, receives its transmission by hunger and love. The drive for preservation and the drive for love, though irreducible, overlap philo and ontogenetically. Their fraught conjugation ultimately functions as the motor of speciation, despite the perversion of nature and persistent malaise of civilization. Civilization bears the mark of our successful disadaptation, and the cost is universal, but that civilization and neurosis must remain identical." Here, Freud gives flesh to the arguments put forth in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, such that civilization fails to account for human drive divergency. However, this failure to account for the drive is not imminent to the social form and relies on a preposterous element, in this term I borrow from Joan Kopczak. In a seemingly homologous way to totem, the death drive and the primal father function as transcendental elements that are inextricable yet irreducible to the immanent social field. They incarnate the real of structure, while simultaneously preventing our capacity to locate the cause of the drive within the socius and vice versa. This poses a problem if cause is the cement of the universe, as Hume puts it, and we may add the universe of discourse. These transcendental irreducible elements of the primal father and death drive respectively merely rehearse the Lacanian dictum that cause is an embarrassment for philosophy. In bringing to the fore these preposterous elements, Freud flouts any pretense to totality, and this includes organic totality. I would like to draw our attention to the passage from the third essay in Civilization and its Discontents. Quote, "What man, through his science and technology, has produced in the world where he first appeared as a frail animal organism and where every individual of his species must make his entry as a helpless babe, O inch of nature, all of this not only sounds like a fairy tale, but actually fulfills most fairy tale wishes. All these assets he can claim as cultural acquisitions," end quote. It's a striking passage for many reasons, but I will focus on the claim that the human animal belongs to nature qua inch of nature. So we are not only denatured by our entrance into the symbolic, but nature itself is denatured by the claim that the human animal belongs to it as an inch of nature. There are no such ratios in nature as such. When Freud refers to the feeble animal organism as the structurally incomplete human animal, his discourse highlights how symbolic denaturing itself remains structurally incomplete. Thus, we cannot phantasmatically presuppose that we simply shed our neotonic skin. While denaturing does take place, the body as a site of phyletic inscription is not simply biological but also psychical. We cannot assert that the human animal emerges out of an immanence of pure need, to cool. One may scarcely count the body as one. Indeed, Freud's concept of the human animal resembles Lacan's corps morcelé, if one remains constant to Freud's peculiar naturalism. As we have now discussed origins and their undecidability, I will end with a discussion of ends. With respect to origin and ends, the human animal is met with undecidability. Our premature birth necessitates that we are structurally neotenous, in addition to our premature death. These facts resist any pretense to ontotheological finalism, which insists that the human animal serves an ultimate end. So, conclusion, philosophy and mythogenesis are Descartes as premature philosophical anthropologist. While our entrance into the symbolic qua Oedipalized human animal ensures the survival of our species, symbolic sexuation does not mean that we cast off our sexual neoteny. We are essentially neotenous as a species and remain so. Equipped with the phallus qua signifier, we enter adulthood, yet we carry with us the phylogenetic and ontogenetic traces of our infantile sexuality and its autoerotic coloring, an indestructible species-specific element that is universally shared yet continuously disavowed. Why is philosophy particularly poised to repress phylogenesis while psychoanalysis struggles to repress it? Man's unhappiness, says Descartes, is due to his having first been a child. It is rather odd that Descartes' treatise on the human body, which is also known as the treatise on the formation of the the fetus, there's my lapsus, finds virtue in the possibility of slowing down the aging process, our premature death, rather than speeding up the fetalization process preceding birth, which would mean attempting to ameliorate the condition of our protracted neoteny, our premature birth. As brutal a biological fact as any, neoteny is glossed over by Descartes, despite the explicit reference to the fetus, who prefers to focus on the mythical juncture in childhood, whereby the child comes to instrumentalize her will over the exigency of the body. Philosophy at large behaves as if human beings were born calf-like, with a readiness to syllogize, as if one's protracted infantile helplessness bore the blemish of a fact subject to forgetting. Philosophy represses neoteny. Apropos of Genesis, philosophy has its own mythogenesis pertaining to the origin of thinking. Philosophy maintains that the intellect emerges out of some primordial amorphous affectivity. Thought's myth presupposes a break with corporeal substance, a denatured, desubstantialized, yet somehow remaining substantial, cogito, casts off its primordial affectivity. However, what is precisely mythical about this account is the presupposition of primordial affectivity. Here, philosophy could, paradoxically, learn something from Freud's primal metapsychology and his refusal to suppress the question concerning phylogenesis. Thank you. That's a mouthful. That was such a bad slip.
Thank you, Emily, for this very clear presentation, and thank you for this. For this
really
slip. Yeah.
Well,
I agree. I
it's
agree.
very
I
relevant.
agree with most of the things that you put, and especially with the slip, because
Yeah.
Mr. Henke is the
Yeah.
truth, right? So for everybody who watched South Park, will know what I mean. So um, I have some.
South Park.
Yeah. Okay. I actually have some questions, but I wouldn't want to ask them because it would actually anticipate my presentation tomorrow. So
Yes, yeah.
the things on metapsychology and the historical truth, right? So I would actually open the floor instead. So if there is a question, and please take the microphone so everybody can hear you, and the questions are taped as well. So. Yeah.
We met, but
Thanks, Emily. And yes, I can see also like a lot of continuity, the work you've been doing on, I mean, for those who do not know, you're really trying to dig out a theory of Lacanian sexuation already in Lacan. And I guess the move you...
Slipping, yeah. Is there sexuation in Lacan? Yeah.
This is like a genuine psychoanalytic conference, right? This is great.
Well, I mean, lapsus, as you were saying earlier, I mean, like, in our reading group, I mean, yeah, like some gems. Usually I'm the worst, but you're on the right track as well. Yes, so just to give you a bit of context, I think the methodological move you presented, you base your presentation on today is very similar to the original move you do in your thesis, which is to say, is there such thing as a real Lacan-Freud divide, which a number of Lacanians take for granted, including me, to be honest.
True.
Here, if I got your main argument correctly, you're basically saying, you said it very early in the presentation, so to simplify, phylogenesis is not that bad, especially if we focus on the philo instead of on the genesis, and that could be a link that still unites on the question of phylogenesis, Freud and Lacan. Hence my point about like you looking for a more Lacanian than usual Freud, right? And the next step, I'm trying to summarize the argument, but correct me if I'm on the right track here. The next step is to say that we can save phylogenesis as Freudian Lacanian because it's the philo in phylogenesis that links with the question of ontogenesis. And the next and final step, and that would be like my comment but question as well, is to say that what keeps all together in terms of civilization or the symbolic in these passages, right? Good phylogenesis and then link to ontogenesis is sexual neoteny. Yeah. So you cannot really divide Freud from Lacan on the question of phylogenesis, on the question of sexuation, because at the end of the day, I wouldn't call it like hard evidence, but why not, in a sense, because there's a debate to be had also with life sciences. Adrian is not yet here, but he would have much to say. Yes. You have a sufficient reason not to stress too much the divide between Lacan and Freud when you actually give the right emphasis to the word phylogenesis, and what you find when you dig into it is something difficult to contest. That is to say that Lacan is a Freudian because what he articulates in terms of like sexual neoteny, the whole sequence, prematurity of birth, up to sexual neoteny, there are the passages in between, is already contained in Freud. And at that point, the distinction, not only between Lacan and Freud, but between phylogenesis and ontogenesis becomes a quite rhetorical one. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's an attempt to summarize the argument. Could you expand on that?
Yes.
Rectify my summary as well.
Yeah, no, it's more or less on the money, so to speak. But I guess I found it curious when I started rereading early Lacan that phylogenesis was a muted coordinate. And if I were to incarnate myself as an index, it literally appears 1 or 2 times. But this was a first glance sort of mode of thinking, and I realized it's more so because, sexuation cannot be thought of unless it is a species-specific logic, as you articulate so clearly in the Not To and in Subjectivity and Otherness. So the philo is there in Lacan, undoubtedly. And my argument was more so that Freud is more on the genesis aspect, and also his notion of like the genesis of structure is inextricable from his thinkings of the socio-political, the meta level of the unconscious. Another sort of question I had that I didn't get to articulate was, I was thinking in the beginning, does Lacan demur in the face of some of the sort of socio-political consequences of thinking metapsychologically via phylogenesis? And I mean, this is something I'd like to explore further in the paper, but more so that I think by sort of limiting the scope to the ontogenetic field, that Lacan loses some of the Freudian threads with respect to intervening in the entire field of human relations. That's also a kind of implicit critique, but it's not really a critique, because I think like that's sort of how I had, I have self-critique in this paper because I came on strong about, phylogenesis loss, but in the end it's not loss. There's just a sort of like it's where the stress falls. It's a question of emphasis. So yeah. Did I miss something else? Okay.
Thank you.
Right. I'm not going to obviously, talk about things that we've talked about and so forth. But I did want to bring up a point that wasn't so clear, was so central to the paper until you read it, which is that, okay, the claim about even notwithstanding anything about recapitulation, about civilization as a recapitulation, right? I mean, square this for me with basically what I think of as the point of Lacanian historicity, which is that civilization in the strong sense, even reading Freud, like civilized sexual morality, right, is extraordinary with respect to, it cannot be considered a recapitulation because there's something, there's a difference between the evolution of, phylogenesis and something that happens at a very particular point in time, which gives us civilization in the strong sense, right, of our civilization, our civilized sexual morality. And so, you see what I'm saying? Or do you somehow, look, I haven't close read the passages about Freud on this, but do you think for Freud there is no particularly special, extraordinary historical incidents, that it is just a recapitulation? But if so, or even if not, how do you square it with, I think, Lacan's very strong emphasis that there is, and so it has to be accounted for differently, not as recapitulation. You understand?
Yes, okay. Recapitulation was it's kind of a brackets term, I think, for Freud as well. But I guess my stronger point is that I'm not attached to the term recapitulation, but we cannot think of phylogenesis as a purely biological term. It's a short circuit between biology and history, and also that has metapsychological or consequences with respect to civilization. I guess that's more my point. I don't know the Lacanian passage that you're referring to explicitly, but I guess my argument is that sexual neoteny cannot be thought of as a sort of purely ontogenetic phenomenon either, because Freud in Civilization in its discontents, like he really builds his argument on that passage that we begin as the helpless babe and we have this we become the semblance of the prosthetic god. But yeah, your question is a difficult one, I think, with respect to historicity, and it's not really one that I grapple with in the paper.
Really briefly, because you're working on Descartes, right?
Yeah.
Basically, to put it in terms of Descartes is the extraordinary historical incident.
Yes, of course.
He articulates it, and everything is even if everything's shit, everything's even more for the worse after that. It's not just neoteny. There's something much more sinister going on. So I was
Yes.
How do you square that?
No, that's very interesting. If we look to Descartes as inaugurating the modern subject par excellence, the subject of the unconscious, it's difficult because this is sort of a question of historicity and then also invariance, because sexual neoteny is an indestructible species-specific element. I mean, it's elemental to our being, whether it's as human, animal, speaking being, asexué, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, no, that's a good question. And I also was wondering with respect to the advent of new technologies, revolutions, counter-revolutions, it depends how you articulate it. But I don't know. I don't think sexual neoteny goes away. I mean, it's an invariant phenomenon in many ways. Whether we have like technological incursions, you know, the kind of quip at the end was about. I find it interesting that technology today is more invested in trying to derail the aging process, or sort of discourses on immortality and technology. But they never focus on neoteny and the sort of prematurity of birth. It's always on the prematurity of death. But I mean, this doesn't really answer your question, but it opens up an interesting discussion, and we can talk more later. But thanks. Tu peux me demander une question en français, tu veux?
No.
Okay. So my question has more to do with your plans in the future that going on from this. So I'm specifically interested in how you may anticipate moving from talking about, as you suggest, Descartes as a proposing a premature philosophical anthropology, and how your analysis of the passages on the development of the fetus could somehow translate into this Freudo-Lacanian coordination of Descartes' later treatise on the passions, which he is arguably in some ways trying to respond to counter-arguments made about the cogito itself and substance dualism. I mean, so like, to put it very, very crudely, because I haven't read that text on the passions in years, so I may be completely off the mark here, and I would, if you're more familiar, please correct me. But I mean, is there potential to think of Descartes' passions not in the traditional reception in the philosophical canon as just sort of early modern ideas of faculties, but really as instantiations of drive, in a sense? This is a very, very speculative question. But more broadly, what are the next steps in the thesis as well, if you don't want to answer the question about the passions?
No, I can, because I've written on that text quite a bit, actually. Trying to square Descartes' late writings, because the text on the treatise of the human body, L'Homme, is from the 1640s, as well as Passions of the Soul, which, as you know, was written in 1649 before Descartes took a plunge in the Stockholm Bay. Trying to square it back with the sort of Lacanian references as well is something I need to work on. This is the next paper. But yes, Descartes' sort of proto-anthropological discourse in L'Homme, as well as Descartes of the Meditations and Descartes of Passions of the Soul. It almost presents a sort of divergent Descartes. But it would be good to be able to argue that the cogito itself is not an asexual thinking substance, but also bears the mark of a sort of proto-thinking of sexuation. That's something I've written about before, also following Zizek and Mladen Dolar and others. But I don't think one can really disavow the fact that mythogenesis is alive and well in the mythogenesis of thinking in Descartes' Passions of the Soul. Like, he really does believe that sort of thinking does emerge from this amorphous primordial affectivity, and there is some sort of disciplinary discourse about needing the will and so on. But at the same time, it also introduces the idea that the body can act on the mind, and this was also born out of his discourse with Elizabeth of Bohemia, who sort of objected to his discourse with respect to, she had a headache one day, and she said, well, now it's like corporally disrupting my ability to syllogize, blah, blah, blah. And so I think there is something to be said there, but I need to revisit what I've done before and also go beyond now thinking through these sort of proto-anthropological texts. But so ... Thanks.
Yeah.